Ted Hamm is an American author who currently writes for The Independent, spelt with a Y, not to be confused with our UK independent paper. He has written many books, including Bernie's Brooklyn, How the New Deal City Shaped Bernie Sanders' Politics. He's back with a new book, Run, Zohran, Run, inside Zohran Mamdani's sensational campaign to become New York City's first Democratic Socialist mayor, which details the astonishing campaign of Zohran Mamdani, who won the NYC mayoral Democratic primary. The book will be available from September. Ted, it's a real pleasure that you've come on Turn Left to discuss this new book. How are you doing?
Good, Curtis. Nice to be here with you.
Thank you so much. Let's jump straight into it. My first question is, what inspired you to focus on Mamdani's campaign for the book? And what do you think made his run so unique for New York City?
Yeah, I think those two things sort of work together. March, well, he started running back in October, right before the general election. And then he famously, after the general election, went to visit, interview Trump voters or people who didn't, typical Democratic voters who didn't turn out for Kamala Harris. But by March, he was a long shot, obviously, at the outset. But by March, it appeared that he was at least getting traction. And the publisher of Orr Books, Colin Robinson from Liverpool, he and we've done books previously together, and so we were brainstorming, and we saw that Zohran was doing well, and we didn't think he was going to win. His campaign didn't really think they were going to win at that point, but we knew they were going to do well, right? So we knew that this would be the first time that a socialist gained a significant number of votes in a New York City mayor's race, and that was worth writing about. So even if he didn't win, we would at least say, well, here is some foundations he has put in place for future campaigns. But then, as things went forward, by April and especially in May, it looked certainly that he was starting to seem realistic, or at least had a shot, right? And then by early June, he was on fire. So, so Colin kept asking me for updates, and I kept saying, "Well, it's kind of looking pretty good." And then when he actually, shocked the world and won, even shocked his own campaign, as I say at the outset of the book, they didn't think they were going to win on primary night, but they did, and because they thought it would go to extra rounds with ranked choice voting, but instead they won, or Cuomo conceded on primary night. And then the next day, Colin's saying, "Let's move up the deadline." So that made my summer very sedentary at the computer. But I think we're all happy with the finished product.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of draw comparisons in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn
Sure.
when he ran for Labour leader. The point there was just to widen the debate. That was their words. No one expected to win. Jeremy Corbyn didn't expect to win. I think the idea was don't come last and push the anti-austerity message. Then they won. And I can understand with an insurgency campaign, it's kind of similar, right? At least push Cuomo to the left, or at least bring new ideas. And actually, it turns out a lot of people are excited for a new or different kind of politics and they end up winning. There was that point when he was going to announce he'd won. I think it was a more conciliatory message that we're going to see what happens, and then Andrew Cuomo quite promptly conceded the race.
Sure. Well, it was clear that the trend lines were clear. There were some things that I mentioned in the book, some things I wasn't able to include. But by the final weekend before the primary, because early voting started 10 days before the June 24th primary day, it was clear based on the turnout of young voters, first-time voters, and so on. They don't post the results of that early voting until after the polls close on primary day. But it was clear that the trends were in his favor. If you have all these young people turning out, Cuomo's camp bet on the fact that young voters typically say they're going to turn out and then don't. Right. But in this case, they were coming out early, 10 days, within 10, the 10 days before the election. And so Cuomo started getting scared. He started talking up the fact that it was supposed to be really hot, which it which it was on primary day, and that would he wanted water at the polls and all this this stuff because he knew he was going to need a big turnout that day. And something that didn't get a lot of attention, but that I point out is that he had the nursing home scandal, which he was seen as sending nursing homes residents back to with COVID during the pandemic, sending them back to the nursing homes from hospitals, and that was spreading like wildfire. The COVID was spreading like wildfire in the nursing homes, and so people would say that maybe he was responsible for some portion, at least, of the 15,000 deaths in nursing homes during the pandemic. And so this guy, that was a scandal that sort of played out in the race. But so the guy who had that scandal, who was associated with that scandal, on an extremely hot day, on primary day, 100 degrees, which in New York City is magnified considerably. But and he was saying it's warm, but not too warm to go out and vote. Right? He was telling his older population, it doesn't really matter if you're, dehydrated and so on. So that typifies his approach to everything. It's all about himself.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You mentioned young people; it's so important, and you mentioned the term youthquake.
Yes.
So, how do you think Mamdani's campaign reflects broader generational shifts in political parties? I mean, in our country, the voting people's voting intention and political parties don't come down to class anymore. It's very much age. So how do you think maybe with this campaign and broader US politics, you're seeing that generational shift?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that all the polls show that young voters, they embrace socialism, or certainly at least don't really care if someone is trying to attack Mamdani or anyone else as a commie or a communist or socialist or red or whatever term they're trying to use. It doesn't even register for the next generation. And certainly the next generation is pro-Palestine across groups, right? Young Jewish voters, obviously Muslim voters, Christian voters. I mean, everybody, right? So that's just something that really happened quickly and rocked the establishment. They just assumed that they could smear someone as a socialist or an anti-Semite or both, and that would end their political fortunes, right? But instead, Mamdani and the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, the New York chapter, there's a division between the national and the New York chapter, but he's part of the New York chapter, and they were straightforwardly pro-Palestine and straightforwardly social. It's in the name of the group. And there were commentators saying during the campaign, "Well, when's Mamdani going to grow up and get out of the DSA?" And he didn't, and put out a recruiting statement after his primary success. So, and now the group has grown exponentially, 6,600 dues-paying members at the outset in October 2024, and the latest number I saw was that it's over 11,000. So, and even then, that's not the entirety of his volunteer base. He had at least 30,000 active volunteers by primary day, and 20,000 sort of like semi-active volunteers, as they categorize them. So, they weren't entirely the DSA. The DSA was the driving force, but there was plenty of other groups that I write about that were involved.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that. I mean, I do want to touch about Israel-Palestine in a bit because it's obviously an important part of the campaign, but you do mention the Democratic Socialists of America. Now, I was going to ask how they helped sort of shape this campaign. You kind of sort of answered that question. They were kind of the main group there, but you mentioned other groups too. So actually, I'm interested in what other volunteer and organizing groups also helped boost Mamdani's campaign.
Sure. So there was, on day one, a handful of different groups issued a joint endorsement statement for Mamdani back in October 2024. Jewish Voice for Peace was one of those groups, and Zohran had worked with them and spoken at their rallies starting when he took office in 2021 as an assemblyman from Astoria, Queens. And so they were part of that coalition. New York Communities for Change, they're an older group, or long-standing group, but they tend to reach older Black and Latino or Latinx, however you want to call that, Spanish-speaking New Yorkers. And then you had a group called, that just refers to itself by its acronym, CAAAV, CAV, which works with East Asian tenants. Started in Manhattan, Chinatown, but now they helped reach to voters in Brooklyn, Chinatown, which is a block away from where I'm sitting right now, and they also work with Bangladeshi voters. Bangladeshis were a huge source of votes for Mamdani. Kav works with them in Astoria. Then you had a group called Desi's Rising, right? So you probably know Desi's. It's a term for country, that Sanskrit term that South Asians use, and but they also work. So they work with the many different South Asian groups in the city, but they also target Indo-Caribbean residents and potential voters. That would largely be Guyanese and Trinidadian. So there's a lot of different constituencies there that they're bringing together. And one of the organizers from the Desi's group, Jagpreet Singh, directs their political arm. He brought Zohran to a variety of events, Nepali, Hindu, and so on, Sikh Pride Day, all kinds of different stuff that happens, that for mainstream or traditional New York politicians, they probably, unless these things affected their districts, they probably didn't pay much attention to these groups, right? So bringing all kinds of new actors into this coalition.
I find that incredibly fascinating. How diverse this campaign was, and all the list of groups you've just spoken to me there. Which I'm even surprised about how many different communities he spoke to. I mean, how did he sort of build a coalition between the different groups and build a consensus? So obviously he's a democratic socialist. The core policies were on economic policies and an ethical foreign policy. Speaking to different groups, there are going to be different interests and beliefs, but how did he manage to coalesce so many different groups around one message?
Well, freeze the rent is a appealing slogan and policy, right? What in New York City it's called rent stabilization. I mean, it's another way of saying rent control, but about 1 million units in the city are covered in the program, and that affects roughly 2.5 million residents. So there's a lot of voters in that group, and in his first 4 years, hopefully his last 4 years, Eric Adams, the current mayor, raised the rent guidelines board. It's referred to, but it's basically they're appointees of the mayor. They all answer to the mayor. In his rent guidelines board, Eric Adams, they raised the rent 12% over 4 years combined, and so that's a steep hit for roughly 2.5 million city residents. So that from day one, or within the first week of the campaign, of Eric Adams's first term, when he took office in January 2022, the DSA was targeting Adams for his relationships with the major real estate players that control a lot of the rent stabilized apartments. They're owned by large equity investors, Wall Street types, and so on. That's the people that Eric Adams was appealing to. So the DSA was on that, and that set in motion what became the main plank of his campaign. But there were two others: universal child care. That wasn't particularly original. It's an important proposal, but it's not exclusive to the DSA. It played out in the 2021 primary. But then there was free buses, something that, as an assembly member, Zohran was helping to create a pilot program that seemingly was quite successful, and that gets a lot of support, not just from riders, but also from bus drivers. The biggest source of violence that bus drivers face is when people get upset about being forced to pay a fare. And then the fact that people, when they're paying the fare, you get a lot of low income people who don't have credit card technology and so on. So they're paying with coins and dollar bills and so on. And just slows the buses down, right? So fast and free buses became a central plank, and so there was those are the three issues. There were some other things that he raised that supplemented that, but so as I write about it, it was a mantra in that sense, in a political sense, right? Because it's easy to remember for his tens of thousands of campaign volunteers, easy to deliver when they knocked on over 1.5 million voter doors and so on, right? So that's one thing that, to contrast Mamdani and his campaign with mainstream Democrats. The mainstream Democrats like Hakeem Jeffries and others, they may want to try to emulate the door knocking outreach that the Mamdani campaign practiced, but they have nothing to say. So you might knock on their door, but what are they offering you? Trump is bad. Trump is bad. Okay, well, we got that, but what are you going to propose? How are you going to help us now? Right, and that's something that Mamdani really they nailed it.
Yeah, it's amusing to watch Democratic establishment and liberals say, do you know what we need to do is more social media, more dancing, as if to say that the policies don't matter. Of course, it works hand in hand. But of course, that's the Democratic establishment. I don't think we can talk about this campaign without talking about the media. Of course, you highlight the role of the media, but this is both traditional, mainstream, corporate media, and social media too. So how do you think the media's portrayal of Mamdani influenced the outcome of the primary? Of course, when it comes to the corporate media, it was a bit more negative than social media. But what can you tell me about the role of the media in this campaign?
I'd say that's an understatement, Curtis. A bit more negative.
Yeah.
Extremely more negative. Yes. Well, I think most people who are familiar with the campaign to some extent know that Mamdani was quite good with social media from the outset. I mentioned the Trump interaction with Trump voters. There was an annual event that takes place at Coney Island every January 1st, the plunge into the icy water, and he did that wearing a suit, which was amusing unto itself. But then what's particularly notable is that the video that they shot, he's in wearing the suit. It's wet. He's talking to people in stuffed animal costumes. People get dressed up and have a lot of fun that day. But then he's also delivering some crunching numbers about rent stabilization and so on in the city, right? So I think the way I describe it is madcap and wonky at the same time. Wonky, I'm assuming that term registers for your listeners, but people who are policy oriented people into the details of how to make sound public policy, right? So he was doing so. Even though he was entertaining, he said something to the effect of humor is a good way to get people to pay attention, and then you can give them some of your message. So clearly that was the case. It's very, very effective all throughout with social media. Now, I'm glad you asked me about the traditional media because it is an important component of the book. And basically, as I say a few times, the New York Times and the New York Post. So you have the liberal New York Times and the far right New York Post. They were both extremely influential in 2021. So just 4 years ago. Eric Adams made a deal with the devil, if you want to call it that, when he's buddied up to the New York Post. And the New York Times backed a candidate, Catherine Garcia, who was a first-time candidate. She had a good reputation as a administrator of various city agencies, but not a particularly dynamic presence on the campaign trail. But she almost won. And that was because the New York Times, like basically all their Manhattan voters and parts of Brooklyn, those are their two main areas of influence. They came out for Catherine Garcia because why? Because the Times told them. So that was the right pick. But this time around, it was different, and one of the reasons was because the Times decided, for whatever reason, they couldn't even explain it, or they haven't explained it officially. They decided they would not endorse a candidate in local races, or they would no longer endorse candidates in local races. And I don't know why. I mean, they gave up. No one typically surrenders influence in New York City voluntarily, right? So, but they did. And then the New York Post was just so extreme in their relentless assaults on Zohran that people just stopped paying attention. I think it was just like they just call people names, right? Nepo baby, right? Um, and he's an anti-Semite. Nothing he was saying was anti-Semitic, but they just they hurl around these slurs, and they have an echo chamber on social media, particularly on Twitter or X, as we now call it. But it didn't work, and people stopped paying attention. And then the Times decided even though they weren't going to endorse, they were going to basically trash Mamdani, and they stooped to the level of the Post, just with these editorials that were straight up ridiculous, and written in the Times style. So I think I say at one point that the Post style is to it's like you're sitting at a bar and they're about to smash a beer glass over your head with insults, and the Times is more mannerly, right? They're almost like 19th century. There's an old term for the Times called the Gray Lady that I use because it was they were the upper crust anti-sensational voice of reason, but you could just tell that they hated Mamdani. And they don't really ever say it. The Post is far more direct in saying, well, this guy is opposing Israel. But the Times comes up with other ways of saying that. But I think that was the essence of why they hated him.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to seeing Democratic officials who refused to endorse. And obviously they gave their terrible reasons. Well, I'm not going to endorse this particular race. But if it was Andrew Cuomo, if it was one of the corporate Democrats, then they surely would. In terms of the media attacks, Mamdani didn't have to just face media attacks. He obviously had attacks from the opposition, from Cuomo, and of course outside PACs. Which of these attacks do you think, though, had the most impact? I mean, the one I remember, and this is all the way across the pond, was a photoshopped image of Mamdani's beard made to look bigger to try and Muslimify him, as if, one, he isn't a Muslim, and two, it's a bad thing. But of course, we knew what they were doing. So which ones do you think had the most impact, and how did Mamdani's team counter them?
Well, I think the impact was a boomerang, or the opposite of what the intention of the impact, right? So you have I read about this in the book. There's I don't know if it works the same way over there, but people who are regular voters get a lot of mailers, sort of glossy campaign literature stuffed in your mailbox, right? About for or against various candidates. And so but basically the thrust of those mailers sent out by Cuomo's, either directly by his campaign, well, more so by the outside spenders who were working on his behalf. The thrust, they would basically just say, Mamdani's bad. Stop Mamdani, right? And they never had a real positive message for why people should vote for Cuomo. It was all stop Mamdani, right? So, if you think about that for a minute, if someone doesn't know who Mamdani is, well, why do we need to stop Mamdani? Well, they might go and look him up and say, hey, this guy's pretty charismatic, and I like some of the things he's advocating, right? So, I can't believe it, and then it hasn't changed. That Cuomo, his ads are still amateur hour. He's got unlimited funds. I don't know who the people who get paid to create this stuff are. Just this week, they're terrible. He's going to an auto body shop and talking to a guy who's struggling, but Cuomo doesn't have any answers for him. He doesn't have any policies. He's like, well, I used to work as in auto body shops when I was a teenager. Okay, well, great, but and I understand all the new regulations and you needed all these permits and stuff, but he's not saying. What does it mean? I don't know. He got one guy's vote because he visited him at the auto body shop, but it's not going to help change the direction of the campaign.
I mean, I think the attacks from the media, from opposition, ties into one of the central issues of the campaign, which was Israel-Palestine. Of course, Mamdani's Palestine and Israel was very clear. Why do you think the issue resonated so strongly? And how do you think it shaped the race as well?
Sure. I mean, I think it was something that was the establishment, including the New York Times, including former Mayor Bloomberg, which basically is synonymous with the New York Times editorial board, that they assumed it was the loyalty to Israel was just an enduring feature of New York City politics, and didn't realize that they could stand by and let Netanyahu destroy Gaza, commit war crimes daily, on and on. And Zohran, as I mentioned previously, was speaking at Jewish Voice for Peace rallies even before October 7th. And, he was became a forceful figure at the rallies right after October 7th. And what happened there was critical because the DSA, New York City DSA, was targeted because of a tweet they put out right on the actual day of October 7th that was helping generate intention to a rally at Times Square the following day. And the tone of the tweet was not appropriate to the moment because they weren't making any mention of Israeli civilians or hostages and so on who were killed or taken hostage. But they retracted that tweet. But even so, that was the opening that the New York Post and their far right allies, they thought they were going to crush the DSA, and that didn't happen. Right. So what happened was the NYC DSA issued an apology. It wasn't even really an apology. They said they should have been more sensitive to the plight of Israeli civilians. But then they said, but look at what's happening in Gaza, right? They're already cutting off the water, et cetera. Israel was. So, and then within a week, I guess it was the 13th, I guess, that Zohran and other DSA elected officials were outside of Chuck Schumer's home in Park Slope, which is central Brooklyn. It's the area across the streets called Grand Army Plaza. And they got arrested for blocking traffic, right? But at the time, Zohran was also saying, look, there's an impending genocide here. And at that point, most people were not using that term yet, but they were using it, right? And he was saying it's impending, but still, historians we're not supposed to say what would have happened, what could have happened, what if, but clearly, if things had gone differently or had played out differently, that could have really undercut or really hurt Zohran and other DSA, other pro-Palestine activists. If, let's say, hypothetically, the Biden administration put a stop to what Netanyahu's agenda, and things didn't escalate the way they did, that people could have said, well, look, those guys were saying that this is an impending genocide, and it really didn't play out that way. But that's not what happened. They called it, and the U.S. let Netanyahu wreak havoc, destruction, and so on. And it turned out that Zohran and his fellow DSA electeds and activists and pro-Palestine activists, they were right. And unfortunately, again, because I look at the crisis, but that showed that if you stand by your positions, you stick to your principles. In this case, that helped them because people, younger voters, other voters, and I think many people point out that Jewish voters, liberal Jewish voters at least, many of them went for Brad Lander, a progressive from Park Slope, but then because of ranked choice voting, they got to choose a second, their second pick, and Zohran was their second pick. And what Brad Lander said after the primary results came in, he told CNN's Jake Tapper, he said that Jewish voters don't like to be used as pawns, right, by Israel to support a murderous regime like Netanyahu's. So, it was like wide swaths of people did not rally rejected Cuomo because he was championing Netanyahu. He shamelessly offered his legal services, and that's a very questionable set of credentials, right? No one has ever regarded Andrew Cuomo as a top-notch lawyer, but he said he would help Alan Dershowitz and others defend Netanyahu from the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant. And he announced that late November of last year, and he did it to a group called Chabad Lubavitch that is very strongly pro-Netanyahu and pro-Trump. So he was basically saying, yes, he was going for their votes, right? And defending someone many in the world view as a war criminal. So that backfired for Cuomo, and they've actually the rhetoric on that has been a bit muted since the primary. That to some extent, maybe they realized it was not working because or it was backfiring. That they thought they could just smear the Socialist as anti-Semitic, and then people didn't buy it.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think it's the same in the UK. Look, I mean, you mentioned in there about sticking to their principles, and the smear campaign of calling people anti-Semitic for simply standing up for Palestinians and calling out Israel's war crimes has been a big part of UK politics. It's a big part of US politics, but particularly between 2015 and 2019, again, I draw attention to Jeremy Corbyn when he was Labour leader.
Yeah.
He was probably the most pro-Palestine Labour leader there's ever been. But questions around anti-Semitism really dug deep, which don't think is the complete reason, but part of the reason why the project failed. But there was a lot of people within the left at the time who wanted to capitulate, who wanted to try and not sound too aggressive to quiet the sort of criticisms. Whereas what I noticed with Mamdani is, despite the smearing of anti-Semitism, he stuck by his guns very clearly. Was that something that within the campaign you believe that they always wanted to do? Or was there worry about saying, we're going to stand strong on this, or maybe we should try and sort of, in a way, some people might say capitulate. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but to try and not draw attention to the smears of anti-Semitism. Was there a worry within the campaign, or did they feel like, one, no one's going to fall for the smears, and two, we need to go down fighting if we were to fail?
Well, I think that's an interesting question you raised. It taps into a larger question about this next generation, which you appear to be a member of.
Sort of, yeah. I would put myself on that.
Okay. But they don't play by the old rules. They don't want the old. They don't play by the old game, which is take a stand and then negotiate a different stand, right? Float a trial balloon, and if that doesn't work, float another trial balloon. So no, they really seem principled and clear in their positions, and don't seem to want to get in all this horse trading stuff that the way the game was played in the past, right? So the operatives of yesteryear, they're still around. But the way someone would say something to you and it wasn't quite what they really meant, or there was some ulterior motive. They were trying to make a deal, right? So it's kind of like they're like poker players. And I think plenty of younger people enjoy poker, but they don't play it they don't use it as an approach to politics, right? So I think Zohran said that in one of the debates to Cuomo. It was either Cuomo or Whitney Tilson, who was even to the right of Cuomo. But Zohran said, unlike you, I'll give you a straight answer, right? And it was just kind of a toss off line. But it was revealing, right? Because he wants to say, here's my position. and that's my position, right? And he did it, right? Israel should be a state with equal rights, one state with equal rights, or maybe he didn't precisely say one state, a state with equal rights. Okay, so that is a position, is his position. He was clear cut. He stuck to it, and the Cuomo and Whitney Tilson hemmed and hawed, and what, and what is their position, right? So they just think you should hold on to the status quo. Whatever the position has been for the last several decades, that's this position. But so here he was. Here's the newcomer saying something very clear cut, and they couldn't deal with that. So it's kind of a generational shift in that regard, and it's a welcome change, right? From my perspective, it's been around watching this stuff for the last several decades. We're not used to seeing people speak from their heart and from honest places. We're used to just politicians sort of calculating their next move.
Yeah, I think people are definitely sick of this sort of slick politician that tries to sound or tries to say the popular thing when they know they're not being honest. I think that really shines through, especially with Mamdani. You previously wrote a book, Bernie's Brooklyn. So you documented, of course, Bernie Sanders and his kind of politics. Can you tell me if there's any parallels between his campaigning and Mamdani's, and if there's any differences as well?
Well, I think the one difference is that Bernie spent time in a kibbutz in the 60s and so on, so he still has attachments to Israel. So he doesn't really ever speak about. He speaks plenty about Palestinian rights, human rights, right? But he doesn't speak about political rights. So I would say that Zohran and company are further to the left on Palestine. But Zohran openly says that it was Bernie who inspired him to get into politics. This first run in 2016, he was happy to go meet Bernie down in D.C. after the primary win. So did Mahmoud Khalil, and so Bernie, yeah, Bernie was, and Bernie, as I say in the book, in the Bernie's Brooklyn as well. It's really FDR's New Deal agenda that Bernie was advocating. Fiorello LaGuardia, someone that Zohran tends to champion or likes to champion. He and Fiorello LaGuardia and FDR were close allies, and in rebuilding New York City during after the Depression in the 1930s and 40s, and so that was the city that Bernie and his brother Larry, who's over there, Green Party figurehead, they grew up in that city that FDR and LaGuardia and Robert Moses were building during that period. So, Bernie's family were big fans of LaGuardia and FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt. So that's the world I trace in that book. So the stuff that Bernie was pushing in his campaigns, in the second one he launched in 2019 for the race in 2020, he launched it from Brooklyn College, where he had attended briefly before going to the University of Chicago. And that's not far from where they grew up, which Bernie still calls Flatbush, but everyone now calls Midwood. But in any case, he was at Brooklyn College and he was calling for rent control, because most people think of rent stabilization as rent control. It's a more common term. Rent control is a more common term. But he was also talking up low cost, free college tuition. Like he knew once at CUNY or at Brooklyn College, and low cost healthcare. Right, that used to be a part of the city agenda. It's not really so much anymore, unless it depends on if you work for the city. People have low cost healthcare, but those of us who don't work for the city pay a lot of money for our healthcare. But in any case, that's So Bernie was advocating this stuff that was part of the city's fabric then. So basically, the point of that book about Bernie was that he's just advocating stuff that's already existed. It's not anything that's totally out of the blue or really that earth shattering. It's stuff we've already known. And now you see Zohran doing the same. So the rent freeze that we've talked about, de Blasio did that. The last progressive mayor who won in 2013 and then was in office for the next 2 terms or 8 years. He did some progressive things, but he sort of was like from the old school that we talked about just a minute ago. He made deals, right? He always had these complicated schemes that he was negotiating with the city elite in various ways. So, I fully hope and expect that Mamdani will bring a different approach. Stick to his principles, and he's done that pretty consistently ever since winning in the primary in late June.
You would say he's more progressive, a bit more aggressive than sort of Bernie Sanders, because Bernie Sanders represented this sort of FDR kind of politics. Something from Mamdani and future generations could present something more radical.
Well, I mean, I don't know that it's that much more radical. He's certainly more radical on Israel-Palestine, but yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty similar to Bernie's vision. And one of the people, the Times assembled a group of experts that they decided were going to wait, since they weren't going to endorse a candidate. They decided they'd ask some people they liked to say who the best candidate was. And there's a veteran public policy professor from NYU named Mitchell Moss, who said that, well, this Mamdani guy really is connecting with people on these affordability issues, and that we got to take note of that. But then he said something to the effect of, unfortunately, he's a Bernie Sanders local version, right? So he didn't even need to explain it. the Times didn't ask him to explain that. So yeah, I mean, I think it's this is democratic socialism. It's not full-fledged socialism, but it is redistributing wealth to take things that formerly cost low-income people, everyone. I mean, the stuff they advocate is universal, right? So a bus fare that's $3 now that's going to phase in too. I mean, I think the programs like that, they're not talking about tomorrow or January 1st or 2nd after he takes office. They're not saying they're going to make every bus free right off the bat, but they'll phase those in neighborhoods that really need the free bus service, that are typically going to be more low income neighborhoods. And so on. So that makes a life the difference in the lives of people in those neighborhoods. Then they found that in the pilot program that I mentioned previously, that low income people were taking advantage of the fact that they can now get around the city.
Final question then. What lessons do you think other progressive candidates can learn from Mamdani's campaign? Not the obviously establishment Democrats. They've copied some of their things, obviously not policy, but other progressives. What do you think they can do in their future campaigns?
I think it's going to vary from place to place depending on circumstances, demographics, and so on. But I think they have to figure out the message that reaches working people and how they can show that they're going to make a difference in working people's lives, and push it creatively, and obviously find compelling candidates, but focus directly on that message, and which we just didn't see in the 2024 presidential election. There was nothing that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz were really advocating that people could rally behind, right? So, and that allowed Trump to pick off certain portion of voters, and other people just stay home. And then obviously to be far more outspoken on Palestine, given the magnitude of the crisis. There seems to be a little bit of change within the elite of the Democratic Party. That's number 2 in the House, called the genocide recently. Number 2 House Democrat. But then Hakeem Jeffries is number 1, and as the hip hop radio host Charlemagne the God said this week he should be called APAC Shakur. So I write about Charlemagne in the book because he was an influential player, Mamdani's team agrees, right? That this guy's support helped mobilize the hip hop enthusiasts in Harlem and uptown, more generally, and in central Brooklyn and elsewhere, right? So he's become a real force in city politics.
Well, Ted, thank you so much for giving me your time and coming on Turn Left. When can people pick up your book?
So it's available for pre-order right now, 15% off, and that when the book's available, which should be by September 15th, you can purchase it directly from orbooks.com or orbooks.com, and it's a print version and an ebook. There are both editions, and then in middle of October 14th, it will be available via all kinds of distributors, including one owned by the richest guy in the world.
Thank you so much.
Okay, great talking to you, Curtis.